Mode.
Good afternoon. I'm Tom Cadigan, Associate Director of Alumni Relations here at Holy Cross, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Lunchtime Learning webinar event. This is the first in a series of 2 fall web-based presentations that will feature Holy Cross professors discussing their area of expertise and research. We're thrilled to have Father Thomas Worcester from the Society of Jesus, Professor of History here at Holy Cross, joining us today for a talk entitled Jesuits from 1814 to 2014. Father Worcester holds a PhD from Cambridge University and is an expert on early modern Europe, the Reformation, and religion and politics in 17th century France. And as a former student of his, I can attest that he's an excellent teacher too. We're so happy to have him join us today. We'll be together for about 1 hour, a great opportunity to relive your Holy Cross classroom experience. Father Worcester will speak, and then we'll take questions from you, our listeners, for as long as time allows. I encourage you to submit questions throughout this presentation by clicking the question function located on your webinar toolbar on the right. Thank you for joining us, and now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Father Thomas Worcester.
Thank you very much, Tom, and I'm very happy to have this opportunity to speak with our alumni. Some Catholic religious orders and congregations have flourished for a time and then disappeared, have died out, or were formally suppressed by a bishop or pope. Other orders and congregations have been reformed at one time or another in their history, sometimes resulting in a split between reformed and unreformed divisions. The Franciscans are an obvious example, with conventuals, observants, and Capuchins, or the Cistercians, a reformed version of the Benedictines, and later the Cistercians of the strict observance, or Trappists. Yet the Society of Jesus has never been reformed in this sense of the word, and despite no shortage of internal tensions at times, it has never split into 2 or 3 orders. But the society founded by Ignatius of Loyola and approved by Pope Paul III in 1540 was suppressed by Pope Clement XIV in 1773. This papal suppression followed dissolution of the society in several Catholic countries and their overseas empires, dissolutions engineered by Catholic monarchs who wanted control of the Church, including its schools, in their territories. The Jesuits, with their worldwide international charism and structures, and their close links to the papacy, were perceived as incompatible with national and dynastic aspirations. Clement XIV's suppression of the Jesuits offers an example not of the strength of the papacy, but of its weakness in the face of bullying by power-hungry heads of state. My focus in this talk will be principally on the restored society, that is, on the Jesuits after Restoration by Pope Pius VII on August 7, 1814. One of the main questions I wish to examine is the adequacy or inadequacy of the term Restoration for description of the post-1814 Society of Jesus. This is a huge topic, and my approach is thus necessarily selective. Though I shall give some attention to several parts of the world, France will be a major focus, not merely as a possible case study among others, though it is such, but also because of its leading roles in Jesuit history. From the origins of the Jesuits at the University of Paris, the Jesuit battles against Gallicans and Jansenists, to the reports or relations published by Jesuit missionaries in Canada, to French Jesuit scientists in China, from hot and cold relationships with the French monarchy, to resiliency in face of nearly relentless opposition to Jesuits from France's Third Republic, and to the acclaimed work of Jesuit scholars such as Pierre Théat de Chardin and Henri de Lubac. I should perhaps also acknowledge my own links to France and French history. Born in northern Vermont, less than 50 miles from the Quebec border, I learned French at a rather young age. As an undergraduate at Columbia University, I majored in French and spent a summer and a semester in Paris. As a Jesuit, I did 2 years of philosophy study in Paris, and later frequented Paris while doing a doctoral dissertation on the preaching of a 17th century French bishop. I did a Francophone tertianship, the final part of Jesuit formation, in Montreal. There we were 7 tertians from as many different countries: Canada, the USA, Belgium, Switzerland, Cameroon, Chad, and Korea. This was a marvelous experience of the fact that the Jesuit vocation, charism, tradition is international. Ignatius was not a Frenchman, but a foreign student in Paris, as were all of the first Jesuits. Travel to and experience of lands other than one's own remains a central part of Jesuit mission and identity. I like to say it is our vocation to travel. One cannot do full justice to the history of the Jesuits without giving attention to the global reach and multinational, multicultural character of the society, from its origins to today, even if some countries do play a larger role than others in Jesuit history. Recent emphases at Holy Cross on the global, the multicultural, the international reflect long-standing Jesuit priorities, now articulated in a way specific to Holy Cross and its mission and identity in the 21st century. To turn to my main topic in this webinar, restoration is a term used by political historians to describe the period 1814 to 1830 in Europe and especially in France. With Napoleon's defeat at the hands of the Quadruple Alliance of Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, the Bourbons were restored to the French throne, and the Congress of Vienna met to redraw the map of Europe in ways that largely restored pre-1789 borders. Under Napoleon, Pope Pius VII had been held as a prisoner in France. In spring 1814, he was able to return to Rome, and within a few months he issued a decree restoring or reestablishing the Society of Jesus throughout the world. And yet if this suggests that restoration of monarchy and restoration of the Jesuits went hand in hand, at least chronologically, this fact remains highly ironic in that it was not the National Assembly or other instances of power in the French Revolution that had suppressed the Jesuits, but rather the pre-revolutionary papacy, a papacy under intense pressure from the Catholic monarchs of Spain, Portugal, and France. 2 younger brothers of the guillotined Louis XVI served as king after Napoleon's defeat, Louis XVIII, 1814-24, and Charles X, 1824-30. But even if the period of their reigns is commonly referred to as one of restoration or as the Restoration, it was not the case that the Bourbons could restore everything to the way it was pre-1789. For example, Louis XVIII agreed to a constitutional charter, hardly something that old regime absolute monarchs would have considered. And in 1830, another revolution toppled the Bourbons in favor of the House of Orléans and a more bourgeois style of monarchy. If restoration of monarchy did not mean restoration of or reaction against everything pre-revolutionary, is it likely that restoration of the Society of Jesus meant restoration of everything Jesuit that had existed pre-1773? The obstacles against this would seem to be many. The world had changed. and whether Catholics liked it or not, the Church as well. Indeed, Pope Pius VII, in his long and eventful reign from 1800 to 1823, was no mere traditionalist, hell-bent, as it were, on turning the clock back wherever possible. For example, a few years before his election as Pope, the future Pius VII had argued that Republican forms of secular government, such as that created by the French Revolution, could be compatible with Christianity. As Pope, he proved to be adaptable in his views on Latin American independence from the Spanish and Portuguese monarchies. Thus, the Pope who restored the Society of Jesus was not a staunch reactionary, opposed to any and everything associated with the French Revolution and its ideals, though some later popes may well have abhorred everything even remotely related to the Revolution. The actions of Pius VII in favor of the Jesuits were not necessarily well received by everyone, and the history of anti-Jesuit polemics and actions may reveal a good deal of continuity pre-1773 to post-1814, perhaps especially in Europe. Restoration or readmittance or reestablishment of the Jesuits was not always permanent, and in the 2 centuries since 1814, Jesuits have been expelled, at least for a time, from places such as France, Switzerland, Mexico, and Spain. Thus, careful study of the history of opposition to the Jesuits from 1540 to today could reveal some significant continuity, though not without discontinuity as well. If opposition to the Jesuits has faded in more recent times in places such as France or Switzerland, why is that? Because the Jesuits have changed, or because their enemies have changed? Or is it perhaps because the Jesuits are no longer perceived, at least by some, as mattering very much? In which case, why bother trying to expel them, or to at least curtail their activities? Restoration, in parts of the world where the Society had had a major institutional presence with many school and church buildings, could have meant recovery of such institutional property. In reality, there was not a lot of such recovery. The history of 2 Jesuit churches in Paris, one built in the 17th century and one in the 19th century, offers an interesting example of a kind of discontinuity and continuity between pre-1773 and post-1814. The 17th century Jesuit church was dedicated to St. Louis, that is, the canonized saint and 13th century French king Louis IX, ancestor of the Bourbon monarchs. Thus, in choosing this name, the French Jesuits promoted their alignment with the monarchy. Louis XIII himself laid the cornerstone in 1627, and Cardinal Richelieu, the Prime Minister, presided at the first Mass in the completed church in 1642, with the King, Queen, and their court present. Designed in a style that echoed both what was then contemporary Italian Baroque as well as an emerging French classicism, the church was built on the right bank of the Seine, in the Marais section of Paris, at that time a neighborhood rapidly rising in economic and social status. The church soon drew large crowds attracted by famous Jesuit preachers, such as Louis Bourdaloue, and by music commissioned from prominent composers such as Marc-Antoine Charpentier. You should now see this on your screen. The dome of the Church of St. Louis. These are photographs that I took myself. This picture was taken 2 years ago in 2012. And here's a photograph of the interior of this church. Closed in the 1760s, after the expulsion of the Jesuits, the church was the site for celebration of the cult of reason during the Revolution. In 1802, the church became the parish church of St. Paul, St. Louis, St. Paul, St. Louis, thus adding the name of a nearby parish that had been destroyed in the Revolution. The former Jesuit church remains a parish church today, while an adjacent building, previously the Jesuit residence, is a state school, equivalent of a high school, the Lycée Charlemagne. Quite recently, in 2011-12, the French Ministry of Culture and the city of Paris sponsored a cleaning and restoration of the facade of St. Paul, St. Louis, thus helping to preserve and draw attention to an important piece of pre-1773 Jesuit history in Paris. We're now looking at the facade under restoration. This was in the summer of 2012. You can see the dome in the background, but the facade fully covered. And then this photograph I took last June, so this is very recent. The facade restored, probably looking the best it has since the 17th century. In the mid-19th century, with no prospect of recovering their earlier church, the French Jesuits commissioned a new church, this time on the Rue de Sèvres, at the junction of the 6th and 7th arrondissement districts on the left bank of the Seine. Neither in name nor in architectural style nor in location in Paris was continuity with the Church of St. Louis an obvious priority. Dedicated to the founder of the Jesuits, Saint Ignace was built in 1855-58 and was modeled after the 13th century Gothic cathedral of Le Mans. We're looking here at the exterior of the apse, a rather simple style with the Gothic arches you can see there of the stained glass windows. And in this photograph, the interior of the Church of Saint Ignace. These photographs taken in 2012. Though connections with French heads of state were not as strong as they had been at St. Louis in the 17th century, Saint Ignace did count among its benefactors Napoleon III, French Emperor, 1852-70. And Saint Ignace does resemble the earlier Church of Saint Louis in that its architectural style, neo-Gothic, was as much in vogue in its time as the architecture of Saint Louis was up to date, perhaps even avant-garde, in its era. Like Saint Louis, Saint Ignace was not built to be a parish, and the latter still is not. Both churches were built to serve a rapidly growing urban population, each church in what was an increasingly fashionable Parisian neighborhood. St. Louis was built not far from the elegant square, the Place Royale, today the Place des Vosges, commissioned by Henry IV at the beginning of the 17th century. In 1869, Au Bon Marché, an enormous department store that was for a time the largest such store in the world, was erected across the Rue de Sèvres from Saint Ignace, and the store remains a major shopping destination today. Comparison of these two Jesuit churches in Paris elicits a broader question of what Jesuit continuity or discontinuity might mean between the pre-1773 and post-1814 eras. If the post-1814 Jesuits had an agenda of restoration, what was to be restored? Recovery of property was largely out of the question, so it did not mean that. But perhaps reestablishment of certain Jesuit works or ministries. Yet what model from the old Society of Jesus was to be followed? From what era? From 1540 to 1773, much had changed in the world, in the Church and in the Society of Jesus, and thus such decisions were complex. Was the goal to reestablish a Society of Jesus as similar as possible to the one that existed at the time of the suppression? In other words, would it be a matter, as it were, of picking up where things left off in the 1770s? Or would reaching back as far as possible be the goal, to the society at its foundation in 1540? Was there a golden age to recover? And if so, when was it? Was it within the lifetimes of Ignatius and his first companions, such as Francis Xavier? From a handful of companions in 1540, the society had grown to about 1,000 members by the death of Ignatius in 1556. Obviously, quite a different organization simply by its size, but also one that had by the latter date not only papal approval, but elaborate constitutions. Would those 16th century documents provide the blueprint or the construction or reconstruction manual for the post-1814 era? Even if some Jesuits and others piously believed that Ignatius and other early Jesuits who had had a hand in composing the constitutions were divinely inspired or guided, these texts were nevertheless framed by or limited by the time and place in which they were produced. Through the legislation adopted by its occasional general congregations, both before and after the suppression, the Society has at times abrogated parts of the constitutions and or added new rules or norms for its governance and way of proceeding. Comparison with the late 18th century Constitution of the United States may be apt, as it may be amended in various ways, but is never altogether replaced by a new constitution. In both cases, the continuing validity and normative value of the original document is affirmed, even as a way of changing parts of it is made available. Thus, new Jesuit constitutions were not created post-1814, though the 16th century texts did continue to be supplemented and superseded in parts, as had been the case pre-1773. The Jesuit constitutions are not the only early documents that have been considered normative for the Society of Jesus in any era. Pope Paul III's 1540 apostolic letter approving the new religious order, and Julius III's 1550 letter confirming that approval, may be particularly significant. Yet the very fact that in the merely 10 years from 1540 to 1550 changes were already seen as necessary raises the question of what changes or adaptations did Jesuits see as necessary post-1814 in relation to pre-1773. And even if the normative Golden Age was presumed to be the time of Ignatius, what exactly from that time was thought to matter most and to be within reach of reestablishment, recovery, or restoration? Might it be the life of Ignatius, as is known in his so-called autobiography, or his writings in addition to the constitutions, such as the spiritual exercises, or his thousands of letters, or something else, such as the lives of other Jesuit saints, Francis Xavier among them? Some 25 years ago, British Jesuit Philip Endine cautioned against what he called Jesuit fundamentalism. That is, a naive reading of Ignatius and the early Jesuits that presumes that what they did is immediately accessible to later generations and quite directly imitable by them, all without any concern for changing historical contexts. One may well ask, how extensive has such naivete been in the Society of Jesus post-1814, perhaps right up to today? Sometimes Jesuit history is imagined in terms of superiors general, their eras and their governance of the Society. Such studies may be principally biographical, such as C.J. Leithart's Life of Jan Rotan, general from 1829 to 53, a period in which the post-1814 Society of Jesus grew dramatically, but also was under challenge from various quarters. Rotan rather obviously is a good focus for a case study of continuity or discontinuity across the divide of the suppression. Or Pedro Arrupe, general 1965 to 1983, a prophet and a hero for many Jesuits and others, precisely for the changes he made after Vatican II, but a villain, according to some, for those very changes. But was Arrupe, like Ignatius, a Basque, perhaps in greater continuity with Ignatius in various ways than were many of the generals of the intervening centuries? Did Arrupe help the Society of Jesus to return to its Ignatian roots and to put aside various accretions of the intervening centuries? Or did he create a new Society of Jesus, perhaps new and better, or perhaps new and irresponsibly discontinuous with what had gone before? The New Jesuits, edited by ex-Jesuit George Reimer, is a book that was published in 1971. It consists of essays by various American Jesuits, Daniel Berrigan and John Padberg among them, reflecting on how they thought the society was changing at the time. It now seems very dated indeed, but it can shed light on how, in the years of Father Arrupe's generalate, Jesuits thought about continuity and discontinuity in their own Jesuit lives and in Jesuit history since 1540. Or a study may focus more broadly on the issues at stake for the Society of Jesus during the period of a generalate. An example is the volume edited by Thomas McCoog entitled The Mercurian Project, Forming Jesuit Culture, 1573 to 80, or Claudio Acquaviva's relatively long generalate, 1581 to 1615, is often cited as a period, among other things, of consolidation or standardization, such as with adoption of the Ratio Studiorum, the plan of studies that was to be the blueprint for Jesuit education and Jesuit schools. Thus, a large and complex question is, does close examination of generalates from that of Ignatius Loyola to the present and that of Adolfo Nicolas reveal more continuity or discontinuity, especially across the 1773-1814 divide? To what extent have superiors general, before or after the suppression, looked back to Ignatius or to some other predecessor as model? And who are the most significant generals in the Society's history, and for what reasons? In the case of Ignatius, further questions to ask include which Ignatius has been taken as model for imitation: the Roman administrator of the 1540s and 50s, or an earlier Ignatius, such as the Pilgrim of the 1520s, or the giver of the spiritual exercises. But a superior general is not necessarily representative or typical of Jesuits of his era. The degree to which individual Jesuits since 1814 have or have not resembled those of the old society is a question that can only be answered through a great many case studies of both famous and relatively obscure Jesuits. The French biographer Jean Couture published in 1991 and 92 a two-volume work entitled Jésuites, une multibiographie, with one volume entitled Les Conquérants, or the Conquerors, and a second volume, Les Revenants, the Returning. A condensed one-volume English translation was published in 1995 as Jesuits, a multi-biography. La Couture studies particular Jesuits he selected, a very large number of them French. His division of conquerors and returning suggests that the suppression was a very major divide, and it is one that puts the old society in a kind of heroic light, and the post-1814 society in a seemingly lesser light. Also, while the French word revenant literally means returning, it sometimes refers to a person coming back from the dead, such as a ghost in a seance. Thus, in this perspective, the decision of Pope Pius VII may be thought of as, in some sense, resurrecting the dead Jesuits. Biographies of individual Jesuits abound, and they may help to clarify ways in which the Society has or has not changed over the centuries. The Italian Jesuit Matteo Ricci, 1552 to 1610, and his work in China have garnered a great deal of attention in recent years, especially on the occasion of the 400th anniversary of his death. But was he simply an exceptional Jesuit, still worthy of an exceptional amount of attention, or was he a type of Jesuit that may be found in other times and places of the Society's history? Or to put it another way, was French Jesuit Pierre Théard de Chardin, 1881 to 1955, a kind of new Matteo Ricci? Other examples may be found of such potential parallels, but a book edited by Paula Findlin at Stanford University on Athanasius Kircher, a 17th century German Jesuit, scientist, museum curator, botanist, linguist, and other things besides, may suggest that there are limits to such similarities. The subtitle of her book on Kircher is The Last Man Who Knew Everything. But to what extent is such an individualized approach an anachronism that reflects not so much Jesuit history since Ignatius as it does modern and postmodern Western culture, with its focus on individual choice and individual self-fulfillment? The Society of Jesus has always claimed to be more than a loosely connected lot of individuals, but rather a company, a body, with common ideals, commitments, and goals. And there are instances of specific associations or organizations within the Society of Jesus, some of them focused on scholarly work. One of them is the Bollandists, a group of Jesuit scholars founded in the 17th century and devoted to scholarly research and publication on the history of the saints. The Bollandists still exist today. Another example is Sources Chrétiennes, a collection of scholarly editions of early Christian texts, most of them in Latin, together with French translations, notes, and introductions. This project was begun in 1942 by several French Jesuits, and the work continues today under the direction of a team of Jesuits in Lyon. The Sources Chrétiennes presupposed that ressourcement was significant. By ressourcement was meant a going back to the written sources of Christianity from first century on, and there to find resources for renewal of the Church in the modern world. Ressourcement did not mean a reactionary restoration of some imagined golden age in the past, but a careful appropriation of early Christian traditions judged more authentic and more life-giving than various accretions of the intervening centuries. A key question for Jesuit history is, has there been a similar kind of ressourcement in the Society of Jesus regarding its early traditions and texts? Has this taken place in the 2 centuries since 1814, or perhaps only since circa 1965, or in some other time frame? And to what extent have texts and traditions from the Society 1540 to 1773 been reappropriated since 1814? Jesuit culture has always been part of print culture, and print culture a key part of Jesuit ways of proceeding. Indeed, the Society of Jesus without the printing press is no more imaginable than the Protestant Reformation without it. For Jesuit publications pre-1773 and also up to the early 20th century, the multi-volume reference work published by Carlos Sommervogel remains essential. Thus, the history of publications by Jesuit authors and/or on Jesuit topics is readily accessible and may make possible a clarification or verification of a history of Jesuit ressourcement. Here are a couple of examples of post-1814 editions and printings of pre-1773 texts, each originally written in 17th century France. Etienne Binet, 1569 to 1639, was a Jesuit preacher, administrator, and prolific author of some 50 books on a broad range of spiritual and academic topics. An example of a frequently republished book is his treatise, Quel est le meilleur gouvernement, le rigoureux ou le doux? What is the best government, the rigorous or the gentle? First published in 1636. There were translations in the 17th century, also later, indeed during the suppression, also post-1814. And yet there may be many others as well. More recently, there have been some editions of Binet's writing. Why was this particular treatise of Binet on governance reprinted as late as nearly 2.5 centuries after his death? Binet explains that he intended this work especially for superiors in religious orders, and the work's title in some editions makes this clear, Idea del buon governo per i superiori religiosi, idea of good governance for the religious superiors. In the post-1814 world, did Jesuit and perhaps other superiors in Catholic religious orders find Binet's advice particularly helpful? Other texts by Binet also were published in the 19th century, even in English, and some of his writings more recently. Dominique Bouhours, 1628 to 1702, is another prolific French Jesuit author, in this case from the second half of the 17th century. Among his many works were a Life of Ignatius of Loyola and a Life of Francis Xavier, and these works figure among the works of Bouhours reprinted post-1814. For example, in 1821 an edition of his Life of Ignatius came out in southern France in Avignon. Another was published in Lyon, while an English translation appeared in the U.S. in Philadelphia in 1840. In 1826, an edition of his Life of Francis Xavier was published in Lyon, while an English version was published in 1841 in Philadelphia. A thorough study of Bouguer could show whether or not these and other editions published in the 19th century and beyond simply reprinted earlier versions or revised and adapted them as well, and if the latter, in what ways. Just one more example from 17th century France. Louis Bourdaloue, 1632 to 1704, was a near contemporary of Bouguer and became known above all for his preaching at the Jesuit Church of Saint Louis, which we just saw. With a few exceptions, Bourdaloue's sermons were not published until after his death. But Bourdaloue's works continued to be published through the 18th century and through the 19th century, and indeed beyond. These three Jesuits are but three examples, all from early modern France, of prolific Jesuit authors whose influence was extended well beyond their own time and place thanks to their publications. Other abundant examples of well-published Jesuits from 17th century France, but also from many other eras and countries, could of course be cited. In a European country such as France, where Jesuits and their institutions and their activities were prominent before the suppression, it makes some sense to speak of restoration when considering the Society of Jesus post-1814. This may also be true for Latin America, where the old society played a major role. But in some other parts of the world, this makes less sense. The first Jesuits to go to Australia arrived in the mid-19th century. They came from Austria and Ireland. They could not have been restoring anything Jesuit from pre-1773 Australia, but they no doubt drew upon the experience and history of Jesuits in Europe and elsewhere, as they established missions and schools among both Australian Aboriginal peoples and European settlers. Jesuits came to various parts of Africa only beginning in the 19th century. Zimbabwe and Zambia are good examples. Though there were some Jesuits as early as the 1630s in what has become the USA, they were few in numbers and founded no colleges pre-1773. By the 1960s, there were some 8,000 Jesuits in 11 provinces in the USA, with many high schools, colleges, and universities, all of them post-1773 establishments. In this perspective, discontinuity, not continuity, between before and after the suppression seems more prominent. You should have on the screen now an image of a familiar chapel here at Holy Cross, an image of a Jesuit ordination in 1991. And I chose this because I think it shows a rather large number of Jesuit priests, giving some indication that the large number of Jesuits in the U.S. in the 20th century did continue, certainly through the end of the century to some extent, into the 21st century. Light may also be shed on the degree of continuity or discontinuity between the pre-1773 and post-1814 Society of Jesus by greater attention to the ways in which the Society survived those 41 years, especially within the Russian Empire, but also in some other places as well, often outside the boundaries of the Catholic kingdoms that had repudiated the Jesuits. To what extent did such survival help to make what followed Pius VII's decree authorizing universal reestablishment less a restoration than perhaps a kind of reemergence from geographic and political margins of the Catholic world? Also, in a country such as France, something like the Jesuits had in fact also survived under other names than the Society of Jesus. Pierre-Joseph de Clorivière, 1735 to 1820, stands out, a suppressed French Jesuit who persevered in promoting Jesuit-inspired congregations and associations, and who endured years of imprisonment under Napoleon. He played a central role as provincial in formal reestablishment of the Society in France in the immediate years post-1814. Pre-suppression French Jesuits such as Claude La Colombière, 1641 to 82, had played a significant role in promoting devotion to the Sacred Heart. By the time of the French Revolution, the symbolism of the Sacred Heart had been appropriated above all by anti-revolutionary forces, and in 19th century France it was associated with efforts to preserve and or restore the Bourbon monarchy, efforts that would prove to be a failure post-1830. Clorivière was among both the revolution's ardent opponents and the ardent promoters of the Sacred Heart. Does this suggest that the Sacred Heart devotion was a factor in promoting continuity between pre-1773 and post-1814 Jesuits? Or did the reactionary politicization of the Sacred Heart, especially in France, rob the Sacred Heart of its potential to undergird Jesuit chronological continuity and geographic unity? It can hardly be the case that restoration of monarchy played much of a role in Jesuit devotion to the Sacred Heart in the United States or in a number of other places in the Jesuit world as it developed post-1814. The Pre-Suppression Society of Jesus had often been criticized for its closeness to the papacy. In France, those that promoted what they called Gallican liberties never made peace with the Jesuits. If anything, such tensions were even more prominent after 1814 than before, as an age of aggressive nationalism and nation-state building, not only in France but in Italy, Germany, and elsewhere, came in conflict with Jesuit internationalist ideals and with Jesuit support for a growing role of the Pope in the Church. Thus, an aspect of Jesuit continuity or discontinuity across the divide that was the suppression concerns Jesuits and the papacy. Were the Jesuits supporters of an ecclesiology, a theory of the Church, that emphasized the Pope? I think they were, but was this anything new, or merely the continuation of Jesuit ideals and priorities articulated by the first Jesuits and handed down, as it were, from generation to generation in the Society of Jesus? Vatican I, with its definition of papal infallibility and its affirmation of immediate universal jurisdiction of the Pope, was this a kind of vindication of a long-standing Jesuit ecclesiology, a Jesuit priority? Even if the answer is yes, all that has happened in the Church and the Society of Jesus since Vatican I and since Vatican II may alter an assessment of continuity or discontinuity between the pre- and post-suppression society and its relationship to the papacy. To come to conclusion, in an article entitled Jesuitomania, Emanuele Colombo, a historian at DePaul University in Chicago, has drawn attention to the extraordinary amount of attention given in recent years to the history of the pre-1773 Society of Jesus. Not only Jesuit or other Catholic presses are publishing a huge amount of scholarship on the pre-suppression Jesuits, but so too many secular presses, the top university presses such as Cambridge or Harvard among them. The old Society of Jesus has never had it so good. The post-1814 Jesuits still have a ways to go, historiographically speaking. To fully answer the question this essay poses, more needs to be done on the last 2 centuries of the Jesuits, including the decentering of Europe since 1945 and the rise of other parts of the world in the last 75 years or so of Jesuit experience. Today, India is home to the largest number of Jesuits anywhere, nearly all of them native to the subcontinent. And Vietnam is a country with an exceptionally large number of Jesuit novices or recruits. Just a few decades ago, these developments would not have seemed likely at all. And the election of a Jesuit pope from Argentina, a pope getting an extraordinary amount of attention from an astonishing variety of people and places, may well have major consequences for the future of the Jesuits far beyond what anyone can imagine as of yet. When Clement XIV suppressed the Jesuits in 1773, I dare say that a Jesuit pope some 240 years later would have seemed absolutely unthinkable. Indeed, for many people, even just a couple of years ago, a Jesuit pope seemed an extremely remote possibility. The story of the Jesuits is a work in progress, a work that may yet have many surprises in store. Pope Francis is a surprise in many ways. Though many commentators mention his Jesuit background, few have asked at all about how he might influence or transform the Jesuits themselves, their works, their institutions, including their schools and what they teach and how they teach it. Perhaps it is time to give attention to this kind of question. Thank you.
Well, we'll give Father Worcester a chance to collect his thoughts, to take a sip of his water. And now we'll turn this presentation over to you, to the myriad of questions that have been sent in either in advance of this presentation or during his presentation. Father Worcester has a number of them in front of him now. And I encourage you throughout this Q&A part of the presentation to continue to send in questions. Use the questions function on the right-hand side of your screen. And now I'll turn it back over to Father Worcester for some of your questions.
There's a question here, what happened to the members of the Jesuit order between 1773 and 1814? That's an excellent question and a very complex question. There were at least 20,000 Jesuits at the time of the suppression, which is actually slightly more than there are today. So there was a large number of Jesuits at that time in the 18th century. It varied from country to country is probably the best way to approach answering it. So there's not a single answer. For example, countries such as Portugal and Spain, where the Jesuits already had experienced dissolution or extinction really prior to the papal suppression of 1773, actually were expelled. That is to say, the Jesuits themselves were expelled from those countries and those territories. When I say Portugal and Spain, I'm including their overseas empires, almost all of Latin America, for example. In France, on the other hand, it was not as severe as that. The Society of Jesus, you could say, as an institution, was dissolved. On the other hand, the individuals could remain in France. They were told so long as they were accepted both ecclesiastical and civil authority, so the authority of the monarch and the authority of the bishops, they could remain in France. And in fact, many of the Jesuits in France did remain. Some became diocesan priests, worked in parishes under the authority of bishops. Some actually became bishops themselves. A very colorful figure some of you have probably heard of is Guillotin, whose name was given to the guillotine used in the French Revolution and after for capital punishment in France. Guillotin was a Jesuit, a young Jesuit at the time of the suppression. He then went to medical school and became a medical doctor, and then when the revolution came, he entered politics and was elected to the National Assembly. It was his proposal to institute a single form of capital punishment in France, one that would be, at least in theory, relatively painless, so the guillotine named after a former Jesuit or a suppressed Jesuit. That would be another example. Or in the United States, John Carroll, the first bishop in the U.S., Bishop of Baltimore, was a suppressed Jesuit. So another suppressed Jesuit who became a bishop. There's also a question of other orders suppressed throughout history. As I mentioned at the beginning, certainly there have been many examples of orders that have been dissolved. The oddity is to come back, I would say, to not only be suppressed, but to be restored. It's that's more unusual. But yes, there have been religious orders suppressed, either if they're more local, it might be by the local bishop, or something that's more spread across many countries by the papacy. But restoration, certainly on the scale that the Jesuits experienced, I alluded to numbers from a few hundred at the time of immediately after the Restoration, after 1814. The peak numbers in the 1960s, 36,000. It's now declined to about half of that, but that's an enormous growth, so restoration on an enormous scale, in fact. Questions about Pope Francis as well. Someone here has asked, do you expect Pope Francis will step down or retire before death? Of course, the whole idea of a Jesuit pope is something I think many of us are still getting used to. Even a good year, it's a year and a half now. He's been very frank about a lot of things. The press loves him, as I'm sure you know. He has addressed this question of possibly stepping down or retiring, saying that he would do that, if health seems to indicate that. I would just add in that connection that I think his predecessor, Pope Benedict, actually deserves a lot of credit for his resignation. There were not good precedents for it. And when most were quite shocked, I think, when he resigned. And I think he was very courageous to do that because, again, that wasn't the ordinary practice. There were not good precedents. Now there is a good precedent. And I think if Pope Francis reaches the point where he's weakened by ill health, he will follow that example, which I think is a healthy thing for the papacy. There's a different kind of question here about students at Jesuit colleges and universities come in contact with few, if any, Jesuits. How can they feel part of the Society of Jesus? It's certainly the case there aren't as many real live Jesuits as there once were. I think the peak numbers at Holy Cross of numbers of Jesuits was around 100 in the 1960s. Some of you may remember that. Most of you probably did not ever experience that many Jesuits here at one time. The number at the moment, I think, is 23 of us living on campus. Certainly those who want to have the opportunity to take some courses with Jesuits or meet Jesuits in the chaplain's office or Jesuits giving retreats and so on. That's one answer to such a question. It's also true that there are other people who have immersed themselves in Ignatian spirituality. Some of the other people who work in the chaplain's office, but even some others as well, who are very familiar with and very knowledgeable about the spiritual exercises of Ignatius and so on. So it's not solely the Jesuits themselves on a campus such as Holy Cross who can be helpful in educating students about Ignatian spirituality, about the spiritual exercises, and so on. There's a question here about France, I see. What is the viewpoint in France today on religious orders and that sort of thing? That's a good question. I mean, the history of Jesuits in France since 1814 has been a very checkered one with several expulsions. The legal status of Jesuits has often been questionable. It's true of some other religious orders as well. There's a very strong tradition in France since the Revolution of what they call laïcité. It's hard to translate into English, lay-ness as opposed to clerical ness, but it carries a strong connotation of opposition to clergy and maybe even more so religious orders wielding much of any influence, and often an opposition to schools or colleges or universities run by the church in any sense. I mean, I would say in general over the history of the Jesuits, opposition to Jesuit influence through their schools has often been a source of much of the hostility. In the 18th century, leading up to the suppression, many of the Catholic monarchs, as I may have mentioned at least to some extent, they wanted control of the church in their territories, including control of schools. And the Jesuits escaped that control in ways they simply did not like. Their view was the Pope should play a minimal role. The church, they already had control of naming bishops. In Spain, France, Portugal, bishops were named by the king. They liked that. The monarchs liked that system. They did not have control of the Jesuits in that kind of a way, and they did not like that. They did not like this international group that was obedient to the Pope, that crossed national borders in a way that they did not care for. They wanted national churches under state control. I would say the whole history of hostility to the Jesuits has been colored by this. There may be other sources of hostility, but this has been a very major one. Certainly in Europe, France is a very good example of it, but it's not exclusive to that. Later on in Mexico, another version of that, and other places as well. There's a question here, how do you see the relationship between the Jesuits and the Ignatian Volunteer Corps? I would say the Ignatian Volunteer Corps, at least hopefully, is inspired by ideals that one could consider Jesuit ideals of service, certainly, and of service to those in need and the poor. That's probably the most important thing there, the ideal of service. I think we're getting towards the end of our time. Tom Cadigan is giving me a look that suggests as much. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that you've enjoyed this.
Well, many thanks to Father Worcester for sharing his time and knowledge with us today. We're so happy to have him take the time and participate. Now, our next Lunchtime Learning webinar in this fall series will be held on Friday, October 10th. Please save the date. Professor Cynthia Hooper, also from the History Department, will offer a presentation on the recent tensions involving the U.S., Russia, and the Ukraine. More information will be shared next week. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Have a great weekend.